Okay.
Welcome to Geopolitics Demystified. I'm your host, S.L. Kanthan. We are very, very pleased to have Vijay Prashad, who is a brilliant journalist, powerful speaker, and a prolific writer who's written something like 40 books. I don't know. So I don't know how somebody can do that. But welcome, Vijay. So glad to have you. So we have about 30 minutes, so we'll jump right in. So, well, you have written books about neoliberalism, and that's a very, very important concept, but most people don't understand that. You know, I have spoken with even Westerners, and they don't understand. And for the people in the developing nations, we understand the colonialism. That was very obvious how it worked for 400, 500 years. But now we have this new concept, which is very sophisticated, and it's a powerful way for the developed nations to exploit the global South. So what does that word mean? How does that work? Can you explain in a few minutes?
Yeah, it's a pretty old concept in that it's about 70 odd years old. Right after World War II, there was a gathering of intellectuals of the right in Switzerland. They gathered in Mount Pelerin, and they discussed the fate of the world from their perspective, a perspective of the right. One of the main intellectuals there was Friedrich Hayek, who is, pretty well known, wins the Nobel Prize in 1974. Hayek in the 1930s had written, 1940s had written a book called The Road to Serfdom. That if you try to intervene to make the world a better place, in fact, you don't go forward to the future, you go backward to feudalism. So he argued that the state should not participate, that what needs to be allowed to be free are the animal spirits of capitalism. So the less regulation you have, the less attempt to redistribute wealth, the less attempt to build a humane society, the better, in fact, for humanity. But this was interesting. They were quite happy with the state form itself. It's not like they wanted the state to wither away. They wanted the state to better regulate capitalism. In other words, to better ensure that labor wasn't given a fighting chance, so that you needed a police force to go and shut down labor protests and so on. This was the essence of neoliberalism, that business had to be favored over working people. There should be no redistribution, that everything should be privatized. You don't need a state function to produce things like healthcare or education, or indeed, elder care, child care. You don't need any of that. What you need is all of this to be put into the hands of the private sector. So privatization, commodification of life. Water shouldn't be common property. It should be privatized, made into a commodity, bought and sold. Everything, every aspect of human life should be a commodity and should be in private hands. That's the essence of neoliberalism. And the way it came back in the 1980s was to argue that when a poor country ran into some balance of payments difficulties, they had a debt problem, they couldn't pay back their debt, rather than use the facility of the International Monetary Fund to provide them with debt relief, the International Monetary Fund was going to be punitive, was going to impose punishments, was going to say to the country, stop subsidizing, your education, stop subsidizing healthcare, stop subsidizing various aspects of human life, because this is going to lead to serfdom. So they enforce this punitively, so much for freedom. The key word in neoliberalism is freedom. But rather than create a free society, they created a more punitive society where everything was in private hands.
So, I mean, it sounds like, the Matrix, where you have all these feudalism controlling every aspect of life and privatized. Wow. And they do that a lot. Like whenever the the developing nation cannot pay the loan back, the IMF would come in and say, oh, we have a plan for reform. It's a beautiful word, reform. And it means you basically have to sell all your banks and corporations and water and electricity, everything to the global corporations.
Yeah, I mean, reform. Look, in India, for instance, the term reform has been used mainly, if you Google the word reform, for labor market reform. This has become, for the last 35 years, a mantra. The state must conduct labor market reform. Now, reform by itself is a pretty neutral sounding word. Labor market reform, what does it mean? Well, what it means is that all the trade union laws that go back to the 1920s, these are laws that were won because of the wave of labor strikes in the textile industry in the 1920s, in the mining sector. Brave workers sacrificed a lot. They were helped along by the left to build trade unions in the 1920s. That wave of strikes is, in fact, what propels a lot of Gandhian protest movements. It activates a huge section of the Indian population. Sorry. Labor market reform effectively means reversing the very acts that were produced through these struggles, which were an integral part of the Indian freedom struggle. So what you're getting with the word reform now is a kind of, it's a toxic way of reversing Indian nationalism, of Indian freedom, by saying let's prevent trade unions from being formed now. You're basically saying, we are taking the side of the British in the 1920s. That's effectively what labor market reformers are saying. They are effectively saying, I would have stood in the 1920s with the colonials against the Indian textile workers. Well, we need to make it very clear to these people that that's the choice they're making. They are going back to 1925, 1928, and they want to stand with the viceroy rather than with the Indian trade union movement. That's a choice. They want to make that choice with the word reform. It's very seductive. They say, oh, we need labor market. Why don't they say we're going to end the right to strike? Because ending the right to strike sounds like curtailing freedom, whereas labor market reform sounds like you're enhancing freedom. So in the name of curtailing, of enhancing freedom, they curtail freedom. This is the danger of the discourse or the language used around neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, there's nothing liberal in neoliberalism. In fact, liberalism, which basically is quite a, anodyne, ordinary philosophy, that people should have some rights. And now it shouldn't be a major component. Although I must say, in India, liberalism has been eroded deeply. Basic concern for people's rights, minority rights, things like that. The erosion of liberal sentiment. Liberalism in India has become the politics of outrage, not the politics of action. Liberals used to be people who'd act in the world. Now they're just outraged. They howl in their drawing rooms about various things happening in the country, but they don't act. They don't build a constituency. Liberals used to have a constituency. They built political parties and so on. Even in India, there were the attempts by elite liberals to build a political formation. That seems to have disappeared. And liberalism itself has been sort of taken over by neoliberalism, which is not really about political rights, but about economic freedom for the elite.
So that brings me to the next question. What can the Global South, BRICS, and these organizations can bring to the table, and how can they package their messaging so that it's really attractive? Because right now, like you said, the neoliberals have really mastered the art of language, and is very seductive. If they say, oh, you have the freedom and you can make a lot of money and you can be rich if you just work hard, just free from the government. There should be no regulations, and then we all can be rich. So it's, well, obviously it's a trap, but I don't see any good the counter messaging from the global South.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that there's a messaging yet. I think the BRICS was formed out of exasperation. In other words, countries that found themselves by the late 2000s, the first decade of the 21st century, countries that found themselves in a position of growth. This includes China, India, Indonesia, other countries which were growing pretty fast, which had built their productive base. They found themselves trapped because they had been growing through reliance upon the US market. The United States was the market of last resort. You couldn't sell something, just the end of the day, the US would buy it, one way or the other. Either they'd buy your goods or they'd buy the debt that you had through treasury bonds. They'd recycle your debt. So it was the buyer of last resort. After 2007, the financial crisis, when the West sort of dipped into the third Great Depression, and which it hasn't exited from, these countries felt, oh my gosh, we are in a trap. In fact, Raghunath Rajan, then the chief economist at the IMF, said that this is a satanic embrace between the United States and China, that China is effectively producing cheap goods for the US market. The US market is providing, payments to China, which is engendering debt in the US. Then Chinese are lending money to the US to buy the cheap Chinese goods and so on. It was a satanic embrace. So China, India, these countries said, look, we have to find new markets. And in many ways, BRICS was more a commercial outpost than a political one. I mean, people have exaggerated the BRICS communique, when they talk about politics and this, that, and the other. In the early years, it was mainly about building economic ties between the bigger countries of the South. That was the principal issue. And then to build different institutions and so on. Eventually, as the decade of the second decade, began to unfold, and you saw the United States acting extremely mercurially. The attack on Libya, the end of the decade, the withdrawal from Afghanistan and Iraq, and then the pressure campaign on China. Then it became clear that a balancing was needed in the world order. And BRICS began to get more and more political, but this was not its origin, And so, there has been no, let's say, BRICS intellectualism. It's very interesting that in the BRICS process, they have set up a whole bunch of committees. In the early years, they thought about an academic committee, setting up intellectual exchanges. This hasn't gone very far. I mean, if I was to ask you, who are is there like a cohort? Are there people there who are BRICS intellectuals, who are trying to theorize the situation of the BRICS and so on? I don't see it. I just don't see the big ideas, coming out of BRICS world.
Yeah, I mean, they don't even have
Yeah.
a website. They don't have a think tank. They don't have a social media presence. It's really a terrible way to organize.
Well, what it is that there are individual people with interesting ideas. People like, say, Kishore Madhubani. He's got interesting ideas and so on. But let me ask you, what are the debates in China? What are those debates? What are the debates in India around these issues? I mean, India is going through a real interesting metamorphosis. The BJP itself, which in its essence was basically pro United States, pro Israel, anti China, anti Pakistan, and so on. That was its orientation, deeply anti communist. Its roots. The Bharatiya Jan Sangh politics was deeply anti communist, deeply anti China, completely pro US, pro Israel, anti Muslim. That was the root of the Bharatiya Jan Sangh foreign policy, which was inherited by the BJP. But look, history makes its own complications. Now you have Jay Shankar there in Delhi, saying to the United States, we don't accept the NATO mindset. What does this mean? What is the current thinking in Indian, the Indian approach to the world? I mean, where are the intellectuals on this? I don't see them. What is Jayashankar reading to come to those conclusions? What are the motivating concepts of Indian foreign policy? It's not non-alignment. The BJP used to junk the idea of non-alignment, laughing at Nehruvian politics and so on. Is it national interest first politics? How do you intellectually square national interest first politics with a BRICS agenda? How does one square this? Thinking has not happened in any way that I think has been valuable. Now, you and I might think these things, but we are not consequential in the sense that we are not, I don't think, being read by the Jayashankars and the Wang Yis and so on. So what are the big ideas? What are the big concepts? It just doesn't seem to be available to us. Maybe there are things that are being circulated, but they are not quite clear to people in the world. So there's confusion about the BRICS project. The BRICS communique, for instance, it's valuable, but it's just a list of issues. There is no compelling narrative of how the BRICS project sees the world. And part of that is because maybe they don't want to risk their unity. They don't want to risk the unity they have by saying, look, we disagree on how we're seeing things. So let's just have this list of issues, the G20 list of issues. The G7 doesn't have a list of issues. They have that as well, but they actually have a view of the world. There is a kind of NATO view of the world. The Atlantic Council, for instance, you mentioned think tanks, produces a view of the world. The Atlantic Council is the think tank of NATO. That's what it was set up to do. So we don't have those things for BRICSlandia, for BRICSistan. Those things don't exist. And absent those, I think there is a little bit of incoherence. I think there is a little bit of lack of, maybe there's, at some points, people exaggerate the influence of BRICS. In others, they dismiss it. And I think those reactions, exaggeration and dismissal, they are not unfounded because they emerge out of the lack of core concepts to help orient us to the world situation from a BRICS perspective.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So we're looking at the U.S. If you look at all these the intellectuals, nobody ever seems to imagine that the U.S. empire is going to come to an end. The American century is coming to an end. What do you think? Will the American century come to an end? And if so, when, how?
I mean, look, firstly, that idea of the American century was a branding exercise done by Life magazine. That itself was not a coherent intellectual concept. What is the American century? In fact, Henry Luce put that on the cover as an exercise of propaganda rather than of reality. In other words, saying that here's the Cold War, that's the context, and the United States is going to be the most influential country in the world. But this is during the Cold War when at least, I don't know, 40% of humanity was not under the hegemony of the United States. Certainly not the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and China and Albania and Yugoslavia, and then large parts of the global South, which were going in their own way, non-alignment. If you actually count up the non-aligned countries and the Soviet bloc at the time, the American century was for a very limited group of countries. Now, that's not to say that what Luce was arguing is incorrect, because even within the third world, in my childhood, I was born in 1967. In my childhood, we were fascinated by US music. There was none of the commodities of the US available in India, no Coca-Cola, no blue jeans and so on. But, I personally still very much like, British and US hard rock music. I mean, that's the cultural impact of the American century. Okay, the Beatles are a British band, but if not for the US producers, the Beatles may not have become a global phenomena. Okay, ABBA is a Swedish band, but if not for the US cultural industry, they wouldn't have, you know, I wouldn't be watching ABBA the movie in Calcutta as a kid, I don't know, 1978 or something. It just wouldn't be happening, and so Luce was right. There's an enormous cultural and information density that comes from the US. See, today, three or four aspects of control the US have already lost. In other words, they are contested around those areas of control. Control over raw materials, they're contested. Control over science and technology, they're contested. India, China, Indonesia, these countries, Japan, again, these countries contest the major US tech companies. Huawei, for instance, is contesting Apple. That's why there's the attack on Huawei. This is a contest. But in two areas, there is no contest. Number one is the area of armaments. I mean, 75% of the world's military spending is spent by the NATO countries. The United States at the lead, over $2 trillion in military spending in the world. 1.5 trillion is by the US. It just dominates the military. There's no country has the kind of global military, thing that the US has. But the second area of control that they have is information and culture. They continue to have a dominance there. How quickly people in Bangalore, where you are, Bengaluru, are talking about, oh, in Xinjiang, what's happening? How did they even know the word Xinjiang? It's the Wurlitzer effect. It comes from, this right-wing guy who has an office just near the CIA office, a German right-wing fundamentalist who writes a report, gets taken up by the US media, suddenly circulates around the world, and everybody's saying, oh, what's happening in Xinjiang? I mean, we don't have the capacity to do that. We've forgotten about Guantanamo, for instance. That's just suppressed stuff. The Guantanamo is still an illegal prison. Where people are being tortured and held, and children from Afghanistan had been held there for 20 years. That just disappears from the news. Or culturally, still people are thinking about what's the new Taylor Swift album, what's, on Instagram. I mean, TikTok might have been a Chinese developed product, but the material on TikTok is largely Western. Even when it's being made in India, the material produced in India. They are doing, TikTok, challenges that were developed often in the West and largely in the US. A cold water bucket challenge, whatever. I'm super out of date and all that stuff. But the point is that US culture, in that sense, is enduring. And in that way, the American century continues. Name for me the top 5 Chinese songs you're listening to now. Go into a mall in Bengaluru. What's the music playing in the mall? Okay, India is different because India has quite a resourceful cultural apparatus. But still, even in India, it's not just the elite children, it's middle-class children absorbed by Western culture and so on. This is an enduring impact because what this does, the infrastructure of your sensibility, if the infrastructure of your sensibility is built around, say, the cultural universe of the United States, you tend to trust and believe them more than you believe others. I mean, you don't believe Russia because you don't know anything about Russia. You don't listen to Russian music. You don't want to eat a Russian, I don't even know what Russian fast food is, but people know about, vegetarian burgers in India. I want a burger, let's get a burger. Let's get a pizza. It's all associated with the United States. So it builds an infrastructure of sensibility. You trust the country more because you've absorbed their culture in these ways, even if it's not the culture, I mean, is it a big deal that, I mean, you go to Pizza Hut in Delhi, and Pizza Hut in Delhi has chicken tikka masala pizza. It doesn't taste anything like a pizza you'd get anywhere in the United States, but it's delicious. But still, in the infrastructure of your sensibility, you're not eating, chicken tikka masala blinis, or you're not eating borscht with some Indian thing. It just doesn't happen. Yeah. And so this sensibility issue, particularly around film and music and so on, it builds a kind of implicit trust. So you say, well, I trust Biden more than I trust Putin. Why? Biden voted to destroy Iraq, to destroy Libya, to destroy Afghanistan. Putin just sent his tanks across the border into Ukraine. The scale of violence. Biden is supplying weapons to the Israelis to destroy Gaza. Why do you trust Biden more? Extraordinary. But this way of understanding the implicit trust in the US comes from their cultural hegemony, which is not declining. And so, therefore, when people talk about, oh, the US is declining, I feel like this is not looking at things from a very accurate and multi-sided perspective. People then are just looking at GDP growth or percentage of GDP growth, a share of global GDP. And that's not sufficient as an indicator for the complexity of how power manifests itself. Power is not just about economic power. Obviously, it's important to track that decline, and it's impactful. But there are other aspects of power that are tentacular. The tentacles of their reach are quite extraordinary, that they can start you dancing to the tune of Xinjiang when you don't even know how to spell it.
Yeah. So, by the way, when you talked about the cultural power, I was watching this video of a Palestinian a child in Gaza, and behind her is like a total ruin, all the homes are totally destroyed. And then you look at her shirt, and it has the Walt Disney of a character on her shirt, I was like, wow, like this is the power of the US. When the US, just bombed your home, it but totally destroyed your life, and you don't even know that you are, wearing the American T-shirt.
Yeah, I mean, it's that's exactly it. I mean, we don't know where she got the T-shirt from, but as a metaphor, it's pretty much there. And the reason I went back to that issue of Life magazine is that if you go back and look at the article that goes with it, it's about culture. It's not just about military power and so on. They're well aware of this. I mean, they built an organization. The CIA built an organization called the Committee for Cultural Freedom, which they funded secretly artists and writers and so on through various foundations to produce work that would go against the rise of Marxist thinking and socialist sensibilities and so on. They tried to, kind of break down the art community, the painters. They gave prizes to lift up people from obscurity. And I got to say, if they didn't do all that, it's likely that the Nobel Prize for Literature every year would be won by a socialist. I mean, despite all that, you had Gabriel García Márquez's book, 100 Years of Solitude, becoming a bestseller, despite all the attempts to silence the voices of the left, because so many socialist writers are so brilliant. I mean, they construct brilliant worlds. But, even García Márquez hated, and I've just written a long essay about this, hated the idea of magical realism, because he felt that what he was writing was, in fact, the history of Colombia, that, in fact, there was a banana massacre in 1928. That did happen. It wasn't some magical realist stuff. The book is grounded in the myths and stories that he heard as a child. He grew up in the banana zone of Colombia. And so when the idea of magical realism then comes to Salman Rushdie, it becomes a game. It becomes almost a joke. You play around with it. Whereas, in fact, this book, 100 Years of Solitude, is grounded in blood and sacrifice and the hard work of people to make a better world. It's an amazing book. It's nothing magical about it. What's magical is the kind of upside down nature of the world, where a massacre of banana workers is normal, and a strike by banana workers is outrageous. That's the magical nature of our world, that a young child in Gaza can stand there and talk to us with a Walt Disney shirt on and say, "I'm still surviving." That's magical. That she survived the level of bombardment that Gaza has been enduring. But magical doesn't mean fantasy made up and so on, and then you have this whole genre of art that gets produced, which produces mischievous writing. I mean, I find Salman Rushdie, for instance, it's a bawdlerization of magical realism. It's not rooted in the kind of energy of Garcia Marquez. Maybe a couple of his early books, Midnight's Children and Shame, have that root, but the rest of it is seems to me to be just a writer with no responsibility. And I think that's part of the American century, is to detach the idea of the artist's responsibility, the writer's responsibility, the musician's responsibility. Must be responsible to the world that created us and that builds us. I mean, one of the reasons that somebody like Roger Waters is so committed to ending war is his father died in World War II. His parents were communists, but his father also died. He was a gunner on a plane, and he never really knew his father. Never knew his father. He wrote a beautiful song called "The Gunner's Dream," which is really about his father, or for his father. But so much of the music is about war and hatred for war, because he feels he has a responsibility to the world that feeds him. And I think this idea is not, it's not dominant. Many people in the arts and so on don't feel this immense sense of responsibility to the world that feeds us, and that's the American century. That sense that you can be irresponsible, you can do whatever the hell you want, you can write whatever you want, you can say whatever you want. That license to do whatever you want for artists, that is the American century. And even that is limited, because if you start to do whatever you want, criticize the United States, you can get into trouble. So it has its own limits.
Yeah. And I think that also like extends to all forms of the sectors. For example, the food companies in the US, they don't have any responsibility for health, for nutrition. And the big pharma, they don't feel the responsibility to cure diseases. They want returning consumers who are going to buy medicine for the rest of their life. The journalists, the New York Times, they don't have a responsibility to say the truth. The big industries, they had no responsibility towards the Americans, so they shipped all the jobs abroad. So it's a big problem. Okay, so one last question. What do you think about the China model, which I'm personally fascinated with? And what do you think about it in terms of the long-term sustainability? And also, well, is it something that the rest of the countries in the global South can adopt and to improve themselves?
Well, let me say it like this. I am also fascinated by what has happened in the history of China over the last, I'm also fascinated, like you, with the history of China over the last period, at least since the Chinese Revolution. I was raised intellectually with the theory known as dependency theory. The idea was that a developing country you would basically accept some foreign aid and maybe some investment, and would develop sectors of the economy, but in fact would never be able to break the chains of dependency. What you had was the development of underdevelopment. You constantly were underdeveloped. You were not able to go to high end manufacturing and so on. And even if you did go to high end manufacturing, you didn't own it. Your labor was used by owners elsewhere. So how did China break this chain of dependency? This is a real theoretical and practical question. How were they able to do it? So, we have in our institute been fascinated by this. And in order to try to build an account, we've started a partnership with a Chinese journal called Wenhua Zhongheng, and we produced several issues now, which are available on the internet in English, French, English, Spanish, Portuguese, hopefully in other languages soon, where we're translating the debates taking place in China on this issue. Like, how did we do it? What is socialism? What is our environmental policy? Where should capital come from? And so on. And I find these debates interesting because it's interesting to listen to what Chinese intellectuals are saying. That's true. But it's also interesting to see what questions they're framing, because their questions are not the same as the questions of other people. If I'm looking at China, I might say, is it socialist? Somebody asks, blah, blah, blah. They're not interested in that question because they are within the issue. They are thinking, how do we deepen socialism? Not has China become cap? That's not an interesting question for them. They are thinking, how do we make a green economy? How do we prevent the destruction of the climate? They are building a city outside Beijing, 5 million people, 100% net zero city. I want to live there. Very interesting. Spend a year there, write a book about a net zero city. How fascinating. What does it mean? How do you go to school? How do you do this? How do you do that? Net zero? Are you joking? I understand decreased carbon emissions, but net zero. I mean, how is that possible? What are they doing? We are interested in that, and in my opinion, what the Chinese did, just very quickly, what I think of as the China model, is that they used the sacrifices of ordinary people right after the revolution to build education, healthcare, and to destroy hierarchies in the country, to end feudal culture, foot binding, landlordism. And the reason you do land reform is not so that you can merely distribute land to landless people. It's to end the power of the landlord. I mean, in India, one of the enduring features of Indian culture is hierarchy. Is caste hierarchy, is the wretchedness of all kinds of patriarchal hierarchies. This is rooted in the landlord as the lord, who's the lord, whose ancestors' face is in the local temple, in the murti. The god is not some abstract god; it's the face of my ancestor there, or whatever. And they wield absolute power in these rural areas. In Haryana, I remember going and visiting villages where they simply didn't allow Dalits to go to the bathroom. There was no common field where people could go and defecate. So that is a big challenge. This creates ugly, wretched hierarchies. The Chinese just wiped that out with the revolution. That was the power of the Communist Party in the early period. And so they then tried all kinds of ways of mobilizing domestic savings, getting help from the Soviets, couldn't develop the economy. They were stuck. At which point, Deng Xiaoping, I think, made a very interesting decision to go and visit Japan, visit Singapore, have serious talks with Japanese companies. Japanese, liberal capitalists would meet Deng Xiaoping and say, we owe a lot to China because our culture is based on China. So we want to help China. And we're not doing this to make an enormous amount of money. And they transferred technology. But what then the Chinese government did was quite brilliant. They said, okay, you want to open a SEZ, a special economic zone. India opened them. You want to open a SEZ? We'll open a SEZ for you in Shenzhen. But here's the price of admission. If you're going to build, let's say, solar panels, and you're going to utilize Chinese labor in the SEZ, you're going to have to transfer the technology, but not just the tech, because tech is in many cases yesterday's science. You're going to have to transfer current science. We want the most up-to-date scientific knowledge. We want it all. We want to understand how solar cells function and so on. And that's what they insisted on. German companies came lined up and handed over, their blueprints. And then, the Chinese took them. They didn't have to reverse engineer because they had the specs, the specifications, they had the science, and they then they invested in their own scientists and technicians, and they produced better tech than the West. And that's the Chinese model. They did it very cleverly. The rest of the third world was basically building SEZs to bring in FDI. And that's a dead end. That's the development of underdevelopment. The rest of the third world didn't insist on science. See, we thought FDI is the engine of development. The Chinese knew that FDI is the Trojan horse. The real engine of development is science and tech. Once you get that, once you know how to build the next generation of technology, then you're going to develop. Then you're going to be able to sell things to the rest of the world. FDI is merely money that can come in, invest in yesterday's, building plastic buckets and toys and things like that. That's all, at the other end of the value chain. You need to be thinking about building high-speed rail. You need to think about building, the best kind of telecommunications. When India banned Chinese apps, I thought that was pretty funny because China couldn't reciprocate. What Indian apps are there that China could ban? Why aren't Indians developing these technologies? You're a refugee from that world. Why are Indians subordinating talent to Western tech companies? Why are they putting their talents for Western tech companies? Even Infosys. Infosys is not developing new technologies for breakthroughs. It's basically a body shop, like TCS, Tata Consultancy. They gather the best of Indian tech thinking and they deliver them to other companies around the world for the advances to be made for somebody else. But you're not developing the new generation of technology. Is Bangalore really a biotech hub? No, because you have biotech outsourcing for Pfizer happening in Bangalore. And so this is what the Chinese didn't do. They didn't follow this subordination path. They decided we're going to create our own things. And now when you're in China, and you know this because you just need to go to the bazaar in India as well, and especially the second-hand markets, you'll find Chinese phones. That's what people are buying. You buy an Honor phone or a Huawei phone or a Xiaomi phone, it's a fraction of the cost of an Apple phone, and it's as good. Even a Samsung phone, fraction of the cost of Apple, but also more expensive than Xiaomi. So that's what the Chinese did. It's a fascinating project, but we still have a lot to learn. We have a lot to understand. Don't know it all. There is no Chinese model that's well worked out and put there. We have bits and pieces of the story, but we don't have the whole thing. And I think that's an important part of the project of people like us, is to try to investigate and like the blind man and the elephant, put the elephant together.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Vijay. I'm sure that I would, at some point, would like to talk to you for 15 hours straight, but we can't do that today. So what special project are you working on? Where can people follow you, find you?
Well, they should go definitely to thetricontinental.org. It's a bit of a mouthful, thetricontinental.org, and subscribe to our newsletter there, because you'll get the newsletter every week. I write a 1,400-word essay basically every week, and it tells you what work our team has been doing, and it informs you about the things that our team has been thinking about. So yeah, that's really the best way. And then social media and so on, but really, please subscribe to the newsletter.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much, Vijay. We really
Thanks a lot.
appreciate it.